we were meandering back to California on our Get to Know America month-long summer road trip when we came across the most unusual place. We were driving west on Highway 90 through South Dakota. If you have ever driven across South Dakota in the summer, you know of its desolate beauty. The extensive dry, hot prairies seemed endless. The only thing that broke up the scenery were these homemade signs that appeared every so often advertising a place called Wall Drug. The first sign we saw said Wall Drug, 683 miles. Much later, Wall Drug, 500 miles. Wall Drug, 250 miles ahead. Many of the signs boasted free ice water. About 8 hours after seeing the first sign, we, of course, had to take the exit into the middle of nowhere. What we found was this drugstore had inspired a little town to develop around it that included shopping opportunities and amusements, including an 80-foot dinosaur, a family-owned traveler's chapel, and the Cactus Bar and Casino. The actual store had clearly expanded since it opened in 1931, and so it was a bit of a scavenger hunt to find the ice water. Apparently, the store's eventual success was inspired by Dorothy Husted in 1931, 5 years after she and her husband purchased this failing store, and 5 years of losing money on their investment. One day, with no customers in sight, Dorothy went to take a nap, but could not do so because of the noise of traffic on the nearby highway. She began to put herself in the shoes of those folks on the highway, and it gave her an idea. It occurred to her how thirsty those travelers must be. She told her husband Ted that they could put a sign out by the highway and offer free ice water. She composed some phrases. Her husband Ted later wrote, "Those phrases were not Wordsworth, but I told her, let's give it a try." Ted had begun to refer to the little town of Wall as God-forsaken. Post-Depression, there simply were too many poor people and not enough businesses. They had invested all of their savings in trying to make it go, and nothing had worked. So the next day they made some signs modeled after the Burma Shave signs, and Ted and his son went out to put them up. He said he felt silly doing it. But when they got back to the store, there were already lines of people waiting to get a cup of cold water. The following year, they had to hire 8 more people to keep up with the demand. Today, the store often has 20,000 visitors a day during the summer. He later wrote, "I now know there is nowhere on this planet that is God-forsaken, because wherever you are, you can reach out to someone else and offer them something they need." Jesus knew what people needed as well. They needed to be seen. When you really see someone, compassion emerges. When you don't take them at face value, but look deeper, listen harder, look longer, you find a connection with them that Jesus called compassion. Blacks are asking a haunting question right now. It's an amazing thing to see so many whites marching for racial justice, but they ask, will it last? Jesus knew that a movement had to be more than a commitment to an ideal or a moral concept. It would only endure if it was combined with compassion. He knew that if that vision for the world was not nurtured by the daily exercise of compassion, it would not continue into the future. He knew that to face the huge challenges of his day or any day, it would have to be partnered with small daily acts of kindness and healing. It would need to be sustained by the deep well of compassion. So Jesus said, "Whoever gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones in the name of a disciple, truly I tell you, none of these will lose their reward." The Message translation phrases the rest of that passage like this: "This is a large work I've called you into, but don't be overwhelmed by it. It's best to start small. Give a cold cup of water to someone who is thirsty, for instance. The smallest act of giving or receiving makes you a true apprentice. You won't lose out on a thing." As I reflected on this passage, there was one word that caught my attention. That word is not explained in any of the commentaries I could find. It is as if there was no interest in it at all. There's no mention of it, no translation offered for it, and not an ounce of curiosity about it. That word is cold. Jesus made it clear that the offer is specific. It's cold water. After being on the road for 8 hours and the hour being late, we decided to stay in Wall, in one of the motels that had sprung up as a result of Wall Drug's success. As we settled into the room, I noticed a sign over the sink. It read, "Please do not run the water until it gets cold. The water never gets cold." Apparently, when they built the motel, the pipes were not installed deep enough into the coolness of the earth, and therefore were actually heated by the surface ground temperatures. Cold water must have meant something to those listening to Jesus. In the climate he was speaking in, cold water could not be something in your water skin or canteen. That would have been warmed like surface water. Jesus was clearly talking about well water, something that is deep, something that takes some effort and intentionality to acquire. It might involve walking with someone to a source of such water. It is a spiritual metaphor. For me, it's also reminiscent of his encounter with the Samaritan woman at the well. There it was, Jesus asking for a cup of cold water. And there he spoke of water that satisfies the deepest of thirsts. Many of you know that I'm a big believer in the church engaging in justice work. It's the idea that we can't just be downstream pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream to see who's throwing people into the stream in the first place. Upstream, you learn that it's usually injustice that is throwing people into the river. Usually is a policy formed by a powerful alliance that's disrupting and oppressing real lives. But I've also come to learn that just as there is no peace if there is no justice, it is also true that justice can seem incomplete if there is no healing. As we work for justice, we should also remember why we do it. Love, compassion, respecting the dignity of all people, as our baptismal covenant puts it. Cold water is the awareness of the deepest needs of others, and this leads to empathy and a commitment to putting yourself in the place of others. It requires making the effort to truly see another. One day during our Sacred Space street ministry to the homeless, I had an experience that reminded me that the church is called to more than justice. It is called to offer a cup of cold water as well. We are called to a ministry of hydration, responding to the deep thirst of others. Some of you know this story, but some of you may not. When a homeless teen was telling me about his pain, anger, and grief on that street corner, all I could see was an amazing young man. And I told him so. I said, God sees you. God sees your goodness, your value, your courage, your beauty. Up to that point, he would not establish eye contact with me. But after saying this to him, he instantly looked at me right in the eyes. With real energy, he said, "Yes, I believe that." Then he said, "Can I ask you for something?" I thought it might be money he needed. But I said, "Of course, what do you need?" He asked, "Can you give me a hug?" A pretty amazing scene, actually. A white priest on a troubled street corner in Oakland, hugging a young homeless black man. a man who needed justice, but also a young man who needed to be seen, who needed compassion. On this Pride Week, I want to close with a story that made me so proud to be an Episcopalian. First, some background. On October 7th, 1998, Matthew Shepard, an openly gay college student in Laramie, Wyoming, was befriended by two men posing as gays, hoping to lure him away from a local bar. They drove him to a rural area where they tied him to a fence, brutally beat him, and left him for dead. Shepard, still alive but in a coma, was discovered 18 hours later by a bicyclist and was rushed to a hospital in Fort Collins, Colorado, where he died 4 days later. The two men were caught and found guilty of murder. Justice was not only administered to the men who killed him, but also through the shaping of law. Although federal laws at the time covered hate crimes based on race, color, religion, and national origin, none included sexuality or sexual orientation. In 2007, the local Law Enforcement Hate Crimes Prevention Act, later dubbed the Matthew Shepard Act, was passed by the House but stalled in the Senate. In 2009, a modified version of the bill was finally approved by both the House and Senate, and later that year, President Obama signed the legislation, which was officially known as the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act of 2009. Byrd was an African American who was brutally killed by 3 white supremacists. Some justice found its way into law, as it did recently with the Supreme Court, making it difficult for LGBT communities to be discriminated against in the workplace. This is justice. But the cup of cold water came from the Episcopal Church when, after 20 years of looking for a way to bury their child, fearing that his grave would be vandalized and desecrated, Matthew Shepard's parents were offered a final resting place for their child in our national cathedral. Matthew Shepard's remains now rest in our national cathedral along with those of Helen Keller and Anne Sullivan and Woodrow and Edith Wilson, among others. Home at last, embraced at last, welcomed at last. Cold water from a deep place, some healing, some compassion. We will continue to pray for and work hard for justice, but also for healing. This world, this time, is not God-forsaken. As we commit ourselves to overcoming racism, injustice, power imbalances, economic inequality, let us not be overwhelmed, as Jesus asked us to not be overwhelmed. Let us not be spread thin, but rather go deep within our souls, where there exists an endless spring of cool water to satisfy the thirst for compassion. The question is often asked, whether we see our glass as half full or half empty. With faith, let us rejoice in seeing our glass as half empty because we have shared some cold water with others. Amen.